So good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program, Trade Policy in 2021. Where does the next administration pick up? My name is Anna Helm, and I'm the Faculty Director of the Center for International Business Education and Research, the GW Cyber, at the George Washington University School of Business. GW Cyber is one of 15 such centers across the United States funded by the US Department of Education with a broad mandate to increase the competitiveness of US firms abroad. To this effect, we support cutting-edge international business research. We design and offer innovative educational experiences for students and provide outreach programming for the business and policy communities. For example, today's event. Together, the cybers around the country form a powerful network focused on meeting the demands of US firms for competent, globally minded talent and up-to-date knowledge about international business. Today's timely event is a collaboration between the Association of Women in International Trade, WIT, the DC Virginia District Export Council, the DEC, and GW Cyber. Our three organizations have a long-standing relationship that has resulted in numerous events, many of which can be accessed as video recordings on our website. I want to give special credit to our thought leader collaborators behind this event, Ms. Andrea Durkin, President of WIT, Ms. Evelyn Suarez of the Suarez Firm and GW Cyber Advisory Council member, and Mr. Scott Blackland, Chairman of the DC Virginia DEC. We have an impressive lineup of speakers today, but before we introduce them, Scott Blackland will say a few words on behalf of the DC Virginia DEC. Thank you and enjoy today's program.
Thank you very much, Anna, and welcome to all of you for this most exciting and timely event, Trade Policy in 2021. I think no matter where we come down on the question of where does and how do American companies play in the export market in 2021 and beyond, now is the time to begin to pose that question. And I think everybody's hungry for insights on this, and we've got a very good panel just to do it. My name is Scott Blackland. It is my privilege to serve as the chairman of the Virginia, Washington, DC District Export Council. District Export Councils number 61 across the country. We are a creation originally back in the 1970s of the Department of Commerce, and to this day, we work very closely with the U.S. Export Assistance Centers of the U.S. Commercial Service. We are all private businessmen and women, and we are all appointed to serve by the Secretary of Commerce. We like to think of ourselves as, in many ways, the fingertips, the private sector fingertips of the U.S. Department of Commerce as it reaches out to the small and medium enterprise community and their export and international needs. So we do a whole range of activities from mentoring to advocacy to amplifying access to the resources and relationships here in Washington. And we are volunteers, and our mission is to serve the broader export agenda of the United States. So again, welcome. And with that, I would like to turn things over to Andrea Durkin, who is the president of WIT, another co-sponsor of this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna and Scott. As you mentioned, I'm the current president of Women in International Trade DC, and I want to just take a moment I know we have a lot of students who are joining us today, and I wanted to mention that WIT DC is the largest such chapter in the world. We have about 700 members. So for students, if you're not yet a member, please consider joining. We have a great rate. We're doing a ton of professional development programming this year that I think you would benefit from quite a lot. And in addition to offering, having a lot of great offerings for students, I wanted to mention that in an adjunct role, I've been teaching at the other school in DC, Georgetown, for 16 years now. Spring will be my 16th year on trade policymaking and negotiation, which I enjoy tremendously. And I'm currently the founder of Sparkplug LLC, under which we created tradevistas.org, which is also a great resource, a free resource for students and everybody else on this call. recently also launched Consensus Learning, which is a new platform for teaching trade negotiations. So very excited to be here with Phil Levy. I'm a former trade negotiator who does not have economics training. And so I have been trained at least to listen to the economists in the trade policy making process. And Phil is incredibly a very prominent trade economist who served in the administration, was on the President's Council of Economic Advisors, also served as senior fellow for global economy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which is where we first met, and authored a book on rebuilding a bipartisan consensus on trade policy. So that's very timely. And last June, Phil was appointed chief economist of Flexport, which is a leading and innovative freight forwarder. So we're really excited to have you here today, Phil. Thank you for joining us. I don't think your task is very easy, because the starting point here, is to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the US economy, on US trade relations, on global trade in general. And I'm wondering, just to kick things off, whether you could talk about how you think COVID has impacted supply chains and international logistics, since that's the area you work in right now. And are we seeing a failure in preparedness or resiliency in supply chains? What is happening?
Yeah, well, first, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here with you, and thank you for the kind introduction. It's a fascinating time. There's all kinds of stuff going on. You asked very good questions. One of the things that I think this has reminded us is when we talk about global supply chains, all the various parts that go into it. Sometimes there's a tendency, and I was as guilty of this as anyone before joining my current position, to think things somehow emerge from a country and appear in another country. They do this just in response to price differentials, and that's how it works. What we saw with this is that we really want to think about supply chains. You want to go from, do you have a factory open? Are workers able to show up there? Can they get the raw materials? Are there truck drivers that can get from factories to ports? Are the ports open and functioning? And then how do carriers work? When this all started, right around Chinese New Year, that it really started hitting China, you saw breakdowns in different stages of that. So sometimes you would have the factories open, but you couldn't get truck drivers to move things. And so we saw this initially as a shock emanating from China. I'm going to try to focus as much as possible just on the economic side of things. There's no doubt that the health side is very, very important and will play into this, but I'll just restrict my comments to the economic part of this. We saw the economic impact emanating from China and coming out of that Chinese New Year week, when normally you see very, very, very little activity. The norm in shipping is there's a big rush leading up to this, things go totally quiet, and then they pick up again. And so we saw the rush, saw things go totally quiet, and they didn't pick up again. They stayed quiet, and they stayed quiet for a period of roughly 7 to 8 weeks, where it was a much slower, things were picking up, but at maybe half the rate they had in the past. As part of what made it hard to judge was that the New Year's week where things do really slow down. Once you got to about the 7 or 8 week mark, you could see a change both in the data and in the anecdotes that we were getting, which is that it was no longer really a supply problem out of China. It started to be much more of a demand problem. So now we're talking about, as we're getting into March and April, it started to be more of a demand problem, say coming from Europe or coming from the United States, where the demand for shipments wasn't what it had been. And that's what we've seen. So I think what you saw was an evolution of what the pandemic did, that initially it was this hit at China, and then the disease spread around the world. That meant that shutdowns. So I think you had three things. You had shutdowns spread around the world when you're talking about factories and production. So this hit Europe, this hit other parts of Asia. And then we can talk about we can delve into these details if you like. You saw particular impacts on air travel and air cargo, and then on shipping. And each of those was a bit different. So I would say that's where we had the three impacts. Happy to dive into any one of those.
Yes, so I have a lot of questions to try to get through in the next half an hour. And I should have said this before I ask you a follow on here. I should have set this up, as you said, that, we've got these two panels and we have speakers, in the next segment who are going to really address the sort of political dimensions of this, what happens after the election with the next administration. And so what we wanted to do with this first segment is really talk about the state of the economy. So what economic situation will either Trump 2 or a Biden administration inherit, and what do they need to know as policymakers, as trade policymakers going forward? So that's really the setup for our discussion. And one housekeeping note too, I noticed there are a couple of questions in the chat, which is fine. We'll check chat, but if you can use the Q&A button, we'll be monitoring that as well, and I'll keep an eye on those questions. So Phil, you mentioned, well, you said a lot. There's a lot to unpack there. You talked about the slowdown, and that made me interested in the most recent US trade numbers anyway, particularly as they pertain to China. And I know you talked about demand elsewhere, but looking at those export-import numbers with China, it was really curious to me. It looks like they're ticking back up and they're almost at parity with where we were last year. Can you comment on what is happening there?
I think that's right. I think you've got China operating reasonably well right now and one of the more open and high functioning economies at the moment, which has everything to do with what is the state of public health. And apparently China and some of China's neighbors have gotten to a reasonably good point where they're having relatively few new infections, and that has allowed things to be open in a way they aren't in other places. Maybe I'll use this as an opportunity to talk a little bit about the vast bulk of stuff that's shipped is shipped by ocean. Air is interesting also, but ocean is the big thing. That's where one has a bit of a measure of this. In the aftermath of that time I talked about, you did see this decrease in demand. In the ocean market, you saw carriers cut either their stops along a route or even whole routes. And it was a degree of turmoil that at least our ocean people at Flexport had not seen in a dozen years or more, in terms of just sort of the rapidity with which things were being cut. That supply and demand balance, you actually saw prices go up for shipping cargo. Mm-hmm. As that happened, they started to bring a lot of the ships back online. Some were taken off for doing things like some of the environmental work that needed doing, but they started to bring them back online. Demand stayed high. And so currently our ocean experts refer to this current season as the never-ending peak season. Normally you have a peak season as you lead up to the holidays, for example. This one sort of got there and has kept going. So yes, what you asked about these specific numbers, you're seeing very high volumes of trade. In fact, to the point where carriers are in many ways full right now, even full planning out for several months. And it's extremely difficult to get space on a ship if you want to bring things over. So you're actually hitting capacity constraints.
Interesting. Well, so for the non-shipping expert, so I've heard different things, pre-COVID, you listen to some of the shipping experts and they say, okay, we're at a point where there's a lot of rebuilding of ships, the stock of ships, and that companies that build ships are starting to build smaller, anticipating maybe shorter routes, fewer transoceanic, and maybe an indication of re-regionalization, right? Doubling down on trade with your immediate trade, your geographically proximate trading partners. So now what's really happening, that was sort of the prediction, but now you're saying that you're having a hard time booking space on a ship on the transoceanic. So what do you think is really happening here, and what are the longer term trends?
So one of the real challenges for the people who are ordering ships is you're having to forecast, you're having to predict what the world's going to look like 2 years hence as you do this. And if you go 2 years back, you were having really fairly low cargo prices for shipping. And so then the thought was, all right, there's not as much demand for this, things are weak. That has turned around. We are seeing record prices now. And so, but you don't build a new ship overnight. So, but in terms of the transoceanic, the trans-Pacific eastbound, people talk about these things in terms of lanes, business is booming at the moment.
Interesting. So this relates to the question, right, that was on everybody's minds during the US-China trade war. Well, we're still in it, I guess, right? But as things were sort of continuing to ratchet up and it didn't look like it was going to be a short beginning and end to this, there was a lot of discussion about diversification. Would companies be exiting China for at least some of its manufacturing and looking for other low cost manufacturers, at least in the Southeast Asia region? But also, according to Kearney, has this reshoring index that they've been doing for several years. So you have, pre-trade war data on it, and they were starting to see a phenomenon of nearshoring. So again, the sort of moving back, doubling down on your regional partners, and for the U.S., meaning more investment in Mexico because of its proximity to the U.S. So does shipping really help us understand those trends, or do you look at other indicators to see what's really happening here?
Well, we can look at some of these things because we talk to clients and we talk to them about what is the right way to structure their supply chain. And, does it make sense for them to move to Vietnam, for example, or does it make sense to move to Mexico? So we have those conversations all the time. So you don't necessarily get it just out of Trans-Pacific eastbound shipping data, but we have other insight to that. I think you put your finger on really the heart of the issue, which is that you've got multiple things going on. So you mentioned we did have this trade war that didn't go away, and nor is it entirely a novelty with the Trump administration. That I remember going to a conference in Beijing, must have been a dozen years ago, where at that time you had some textiles manufacturers talking about how they were going to pursue a China plus one strategy, because we were having discussions at the time about the currency and would we have a trade war over the currency. So it's not an entire novelty about this. So you've got all the trade rumblings that I know our successor panel will get into a bit more where this goes, but you had all these trade rumblings. You're also getting serious demographic change. You had China's labor force kind of peaking in size, which meant that it has been a while since China was the low-cost leader for producing everything. Usually, China's claim to fame now is not that they produce it cheaper than anyone else. It's that they organize supply chains better than anyone else, so that if you are a producer, say you're trying to produce, men's jeans, it's easier to do it. Not cheaper necessarily, but everything will work, and the place where you're going to go get a zipper or a button is right nearby, and you can handle all of that stuff. And the logistics, the ports will work well, everything will work well. And so prior to the pandemic, we had seen people exploring options for all of these reasons, for reasons of cost, for reasons of concern about the trade war. You mentioned that with the trade war, it was clear that it was going to last a long time. I think there was actually a lot of confusion about that. The businesses that I talked to, and partly you were getting statements out of the White House that this would be a relatively short affair, that it would be sort of easy to win and you'd make progress. And so that's a big question for people who are thinking about restructuring their supply chains. So I'll give you one example. I won't name any names. I was talking to one manufacturer who was producing, I think it was a medical device, major input coming from China. They had priced out Mexico. The challenge for them was that Mexico was just shy of 25% more expensive than China. If you add a 25% tariff to China, it looks marginally better for Mexico. Obviously, it's easier for the most part to have something nearby. There's less transit time for the most part. But they were concerned because what happens if the tariffs ended? And not only that, but they had competitors who were sourcing from China and weren't facing 25% tariffs. So you've had lots of companies looking at this. You've had some companies moving. You've seen lots of additional activity, for example, in Vietnam. But Vietnam is nowhere near as big as China. And that as that has ramped up, the ability to sort of source from there and the ability to sort of to pull things through their infrastructure has really been stretched. So people have looked at it, they've tried, and they've looked at places like Mexico. Mexico got very hard hit by COVID as well. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the challenges. And it was one of the reasons I mentioned that while you had things starting off in China, it spread around the world. So that nearshoring idea that somehow that insulates you from these kind of concerns and shocks, in this case, it really didn't. You had a lot of US manufacturers who expressed concerns about Mexican factories shutting down, being deemed non-essential, even though they were supplying critical parts to US manufacturers.
There is so much in what you just said. And it's so complex and interesting. And personally, I always felt that the tariffs would be in place for a good long while, just because I think if you're if you're kind of indicating that you're wanting to induce companies to relook at their dependence on China, you have to think that you as a company have to believe that that's going to be a long-term proposition, that you can't just ride it out, I think. But what do I know? I wasn't in charge of the policy. Um, the
I
other,
agree with you, by the way, and that would have been my prediction. But this is an expensive investment for the companies. This is not something you do overnight or cheaply when you think about retooling something like this. And you would have a whole parade of senators coming out of the White House saying, we're almost there. And I'm talking about, over a year ago, we're almost there. We're just about to settle this thing. Hang tight. And that's what some of these people are hearing. And it's hard to know. And you're betting a lot of money on it.
yeah, we've also seen a layering of tariffs over the years. People say, well, I know this for the next panel, I'm not going to speculate, but what would we see in the next administration in terms of approach to tariffs? I kind of remind people that you have to think about 5 different kinds of tariffs at least. We had the Section 201 tariffs, we had the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, we have the China 301 tariffs, we have retaliatory tariffs in WTO cases. We have, the right being sanctioned to use those, and then we have the normal AD/CVD tariffs going on, which have also, I don't know if they've escalated or not, but you've got a lot going on in the tariff space that not all of
You're
which is
absolutely
easy
right.
to unwind.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Although I think if you just wanted to focus on the 301 tariffs, at least for the moment, those are dwarfing everything else. You're right. And it's, when one hears that we hadn't put tariffs on China before, we absolutely had. And it's in those other categories that you talked about, especially the anti-dumping and the countervailing duties. But I think the right now it's the 301 tariffs that really dominate, and the breadth of their coverage is much bigger. And so that's what you probably have companies reacting to the most.
Do you also, I mean, you mentioned, yeah, and I want to ask you what you think the tariff effect has been. But before we do that, I'm wondering, you talked about the sort of clustering. I think it's fascinating that you've got so much manufacturing clustering that has happened over the years in China, specialization, right, in different cities and regions. They got really good at a lot of stuff, but that there are other dynamics going on. And the Chinese government itself is de-investing and not promoting as much the low-end manufacturing in favor of more advanced manufacturing and high tech. So is that part of this too, the shift in looking at other markets, that the government itself in China is less interested? I mean, they don't want to, have unemployment, but it's certainly not a priority for them to invest in low-end manufacturing at this point.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think one of the intriguing things as you look back over the last 20 years or so has been, what role did the export boom play in China's development? Because if you look at the numbers, it's not that an extraordinary part of China's growth was sort of driven by exports. It is, I would argue, and I'm stealing from others here shamelessly, but it is more that this was the sector where international prices played in a little bit more. Were there subsidies there? Yes, of course there were subsidies there, but not quite to the same extent. That often you have that sector where it was private industry that was doing more, that had a bigger role compared to the rest of the Chinese economy, as opposed to others where the employment was a bigger concern and you had, say, state-owned enterprises doing a driving role.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that the sector, when you're talking about low-end manufacturing, was as dependent for its survival, or that it is as dependent now, we can take the past as given, on subsidies as some of these newer sectors. And you're right, those tend to be high tech, part of China 2025. What's our plan? Where we want to go? We'll see how well that's worked. I think it's where they've had their success has been more where the private sector has been able to respond and look at. You often had, for example, Hong Kong investors coming in, able to say, we know how to take advantage of what's on offer.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, sticking with that strand for just a moment too, that what are you looking at as an economist, knowing that there's all this happening in the background, and some of the policies pertaining to this shift into high tech are more in the realm of growing export controls, increased use of that, more blacklisting, dozens of Chinese entities, government and non-government, being blacklisted, Europe doing the same thing, and China starting to do the same thing itself. How do you dial all of that in from an economist's point of view?
It's a great question. I think things have gotten much more intricate, and at a time when we probably need cooperation more than ever, we've got less cooperation than we've had in many decades. Um, you're right, and some of this has to do with things like, do we trust Chinese firms to provide a 5G network? But it also gets to questions of how are we regulating technology? Is everybody equally comfortable from an antitrust standpoint, say, with tech giants? We've seen Europe, make moves recently. Or how do we tax these things? And does that, in effect, end up working like a tariff and an obstacle? Except it's much subtler than the tariff that you have to pay at customs when you bring a physical good across. It's a really intricate time, and I think it's getting to some questions that are very, very difficult. The thing that I would say, which I've often found disappointing in the discourse, which I would think one could pose as a question to the candidates if we were actually having serious discourse, is there are all kinds of reasons that one might be concerned about China, but at the end of the day, you are going to have China as the world's second biggest economy. And even if the US wanted to completely separate from China, US trading partners do not. And therefore, they're going to be integrated into supply chains. It's going to mean that competitors have access to Chinese parts, which means that China is going to be influencing prices. So a real vision should be a vision that says, how do we coexist? Because this idea that we're building sort of a new Great Wall somehow across the Pacific and that we won't have anything to do with them, it's hard for me to see how that's viable.
Well, and where we are now, we didn't anticipate COVID, but now we're in COVID. China seems to be recovering better than anybody. Our numbers maybe are less bad, less horrible than we thought. I'm not sure, but it's hard. The concept of time, I think, for everybody in this pandemic year has been sort of morphed, right? It's time. Time seems to be suspended. We're still in this horrible year. But we started the year with a truce with China. That was just January. And I'm curious about, so everybody was sort of looking at that and saying, we think maybe this is the beginning of tariffs coming down. But nobody really, I think, stopped to ask the question that was on my mind, which is, were we really better able to ride an unprecedented level of tariffs out in our economy better than anybody anticipated we might? And I know you don't have to say, I mean, no, we don't have to say we like tariffs or hate tariffs, but was the U.S. economy able to absorb this in a way that we didn't expect? Or do you think it was damaging?
I think it was damaging. I think it's very hard to quantify exactly because usually the way we quantify things as economists is we hold everything else constant, we make a change, or we try to simulate that as best we can using econometrics. And it's extremely hard to do because we've rarely seen shocks of the sort that we're seeing. But no, I think it's been costly to businesses, and they've been stuck having that debate that you and I had just a few minutes ago, which is, do I ride this out for a short time period, or do I make a big investment and assume this is going to last for a long time? It's often easier to do nothing. You take a hit, but if you take a hit when things are reasonably good, and the economy was doing reasonably well heading into all this, maybe you've got a little room to survive it for a year or so. I don't think you could have American businesses, at least this is what the ones I've talked to have said, where they're paying 25% more for a key part than their international competitors are. That's not a long-term viable proposition. It might be something that they can withstand for a bit as they play for time. But no, I think it did have an effect. We've had some careful studies that have looked at this sort of celebrated question of who actually paid the tariffs. And that was even from some authors who had predicted, it could go either way. It probably would go either way. We know theoretically it could be that it's not a laughable idea in any way that the Chinese would pay the tariffs. It just doesn't seem to be what happened empirically. That a whole range of studies have found, no, this was the US that paid. And we know that that has an effect. Did that alone bring the US economy to its knees? No, it didn't. All the other things did. But I think it's fair to say that it has had a serious and negative impact. And I think most of the advocates for doing it probably said it was an investment to get you into another place. Some people like tariffs for their own sake, but then the other part of that argument was, well, there's long-standing concerns that we have with China, And this is just what you have to go through to get to the other side and to achieve the reforms that we need. Both arguments were made. I think the second one was more plausible. Whether it worked is a different question.
Yeah, interesting. I don't typically read like you do this, but I don't. I don't typically read papers that have Greek in them, assuming that I might be able to understand them. But I recently heard Nicholas Bloom talking about the concept of uncertainty and how you measure uncertainty, and could see that certain trade events in recent years were having a massive impact on sort of the concept of business uncertainty, the trade war, Brexit. But that when you look at his charts, COVID was, way high on the chart versus even those events as disruptive, as they have been. So businesses are really trying to figure out how to measure uncertainty.
Yeah, well, and they don't like the uncertainty, and his work has sort of demonstrated some of the effect that has. You were a trade negotiator. The rate of change that we're getting now is nothing like what one had before. That before you'd have, okay, we're working on a trade deal. It's going to take several years. We'll run it by all the advisory committees. Within a few years, there's a certain chance that this will result in a cut in your tariffs. It won't necessarily be a very large cut, but it'll be progress, it'll be things. But that was the pace at which things were moving. So over, half a decade or a decade, yeah, you'd actually maybe see some change. We were having a while there where it was every few months.
Yeah.
You were getting dramatic changes, 10% tariffs, 25% tariffs, jumping around with promises that I think it's going to go down soon, but it might not go down soon. We're going to have a big deal. We're not having a deal. We called this off. And so, yeah, I think, and that's part of where the damage was, that this, to a large extent, froze businesses, and they had a very difficult time reacting, exactly because if you decide I'm going to move my supply chain from Shenzhen to Guadalajara, that is a costly and time-consuming thing to do. Just like, maybe not quite as extreme as the shipbuilding we talked about earlier, but it's not an overnight thing, and it's not something you switch back easily. So that's a very challenging time for business.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been fun to teach, but I wouldn't want to be still advising a company at this point. So speaking of all the other things that happened in trade policy over the last few years, there was a lot. There was, some anticipation about TPP, and then not. And then there's the renegotiation of USMCA, of NAFTA into USMCA, renegotiated with Korea. Worked on a part one of a deal with Japan, and then of course the China deal. Is it too soon from your perspective to understand the impact of those trade deals? Are we, do you look at it and say it's going to be a few years before we know really what happened to the economy and jobs and other things as a result of those new deals?
I think actually, if you're looking for a good, solid economic estimate, the Greek that you're learning to love, where somebody does these things, we're going to have a hard time ever getting there. And part of the reason is that if you look at, there was a lot of rhetoric, but if you look at what a lot of the changes were, let me set aside the TPP thing for a second, and we can look at, say, the Korea agreement, the Japan agreement, and then most of all USMCA. The changes were fairly modest, even in expectation, even in what we thought was going to happen. So in the Korea case, there was expansion of a quota on cars where that quota wasn't even being filled at that moment. There were other things. There was sort of an adjustment on pharmaceuticals, if I recall correctly. Japan was limited. USMCA, when you had analyses both by the U.S. International Trade Commission and by the IMF, they came out with estimates that were pretty close to zero for what the net impact was supposed to be. And so the reason I say we're not going to find something is, if you are trying to get a minor change in a time when the whole economy is getting buffeted around, essentially our detectors won't be sensitive enough to pick this up. That, by the way, not to make this purely a critique of the Trump administration, but that was actually true of NAFTA as well. Looking back to see, there was some tumult in 1994. Looking back at the studies that tried to pick up what did NAFTA do, they generally have not shown that this was a momentous event. Now, the caveat I will put on this is there's a very important interaction here between commercial relations and foreign relations. Mm-hmm. And our foreign relations are important. And now we circle back to the TPP stuff. So whereas what NAFTA did was it sort of made for a circumstance where we had a close cooperative relationship with Canada and Mexico. That's not trivial. That's not trivial at all.
Right.
When you look at the TPP, part of what this was supposed to do, as you know very well, was be a way to sort of put pressure on China and solidify the US role in the Asia Pacific. Leaving didn't do that. In fact, they went ahead without us. It sort of transformed into the CPTPP, but it was out there. The US wasn't part of the rule setting body. So there are consequences to that. They're a lot harder to capture with econometrics. So I don't mean to say that none of this matters. It absolutely does. But I don't think we're going to be able to get you a good, percentage and T statistics of the sort I know you so desperately want.
Well, it's always been my contention, as fun as trade negotiations are to do, we're always playing catch up. I mean, business is in the forefront, right? So it's, you can't anticipate that, and negotiations take a while. So you feel like you're really always playing catch up with where the state of commerce is. So we have just a few minutes left. I see some questions coming in, but I'm going to ask you maybe one last that's on my list, and then take a look at what we have in the Q&A. So the WTO also, our friend Bob Koopman released some numbers earlier in October.
Yeah.
And, the predictions were dire early in the year. In April, I think they predicted a 12.9% drop, and that was the optimistic scenario. And now they revised that to only a 9.2% drop in world trade. But also said they expected it to rebound to 7.2% next year. So how do we understand those numbers? How do you interpret those numbers? And how do you look at the role of global trade volumes in the context of overall GDP recovery for key nations and for the global economy?
Yeah, interesting, difficult question. I'm glad we have another half an hour to talk about this. No, I'm just kidding. I think, so first, kudos to the WTO for what they've done on this and for their candor, because if you went and, as you saw, you noted that this was their optimistic forecast that they did in April. They gave an optimistic and a pessimistic, and there was a fairly big range. It was an enormous range, which I thought was, nice on their part. They didn't pretend that their crystal ball let them see exactly. I think we have seen some evidence of things picking up. I think one of the things we've learned through this pandemic is that people's health and their perceptions of what is healthy have driven an awful lot of behavior. That when we look at some real-time data, say inside the United States, it's not so much shutdown decisions or government mandates as it often, because you've sometimes seen those lifted and you don't see, consumer behavior respond right away. So it's a huge amount of this depends on what is the course of the pandemic. And that's very hard to know. Lately, the numbers we've been seeing have not been encouraging. But if we get a success that comes soon in terms of either treatment or prevention, or if public health measures have more effect, that would be positive. If not, we're seeing potential slowdowns that accompany this. There have been hope initially for a big rebound. I will say this: it's also important to remember that there is a difference between what we are seeing in GDP numbers and what you're seeing in international trade. That for the most part, with advanced economies, you have something like 70 to 80% services in the economies. And these are the restaurants, movie theaters, hotels, educational institutions, bankers, all of the stuff that we often think of, that's a lot of the activity. Whereas goods and goods trade has been a smaller part. Some of what we've seen is a real rotation that, if you can't go to the gym, there's a service. You instead order, your exercise bike to do stuff from home.
Well, maybe you should. I haven't, but you probably should.
Quite a few do. But the point is that all of a sudden becomes a demand for shipping and a demand for trade. So I think this is what we've seen for a while, where it looked like GDP was outpacing trade. We may have a while where this gets reversed to the extent that people are getting more focused. Obviously, there's trade and services as well, but it gets dwarfed by goods trade. We may see goods trade exceeding as people look for, send me my shipments of exercise bikes, yeast, and flour.
Yeah, right. There are a couple of questions that are related here in the Q&A. And they're sort of back to the supply chain question. So one is from a colleague, Mike Moore, from GW, and it's related to another one, which has to do with the sense that supply chain disruptions, is there a short-term, is the change in supply chain or sort of rearranging or whatever you call it, is it a short-term response to COVID and or Trump policy, or is it part of a longer-term reassessment of basic business strategies? And a related question that has come in is, do you encourage the simplification of supply chains so that companies don't have to have goods passing through so many different countries and so many stops along the production process?
Yeah, great question and good to hear from Mike. I would say it's very hard. The evidence that I have seen so far, it's hard to tease out a separate COVID effect for people doing different things with their supply chains. So the ongoing trends that were there, they're still there. So you've had a lot of companies ask questions, but they were asking questions before. And sometimes the answers are, you like the company I mentioned, you look into the possibility of reworking your supply chain and you just decide that doesn't make sense. I think, and actually as part of the answer to the other part of the question, what sort of drove people to do complicated global supply chains in the first place? Usually the answer was price pressures, right? That you are, a chief operating officer of a company or a chief financial officer, and you're being, pushed to get costs down because that's going to feed to your bottom line. How do you do that? And you find out, you know what, I can take this part of the production process and I can move it over there. And even inclusive of shipping costs, that will cut my costs. I will improve my bottom line. Those were all the things that drove those in the first place. And those pressures have not abated. The question then, I think, is to what extent are companies going to be willing to assume additional costs, and figuratively speaking, which end up being like insurance payments, where you take on additional costs, maybe it gives you a more robust supply chain. I'm actually a little bit skeptical of this because I think there's going to be a danger that you do this. First, it depends what kind of investments actually give you a more robust supply chain. Like I said, if you had moved from China to Mexico, you did not necessarily get a more robust supply chain, facing this. But also how long a company can say, well, I'm effectively insured against this event, but my competitors aren't, and they're undercutting me regularly. That you're going to keep seeing those pressures. So until those pressures abate, I think you're going to get companies reacting to them.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have other shifts going on too with this, looking at what kind of legislation you could use or policy tools you could use to bring back domestic production of certain critical items, what kind of considerations can go into that. Industrial policy is sort of making a comeback in advanced technology sectors like semiconductors. So there's this is a shifting landscape. As you said, the pace is incredibly swift. And we're sort of out of time. I could have asked you 10 more questions along these lines. But thank you for helping to make me smarter. I hope everybody else on the call is a lot smarter for having listened to you for the last 45 minutes. So I do want to mention one question here that I'll just tee up for Evelyn for the next panel, because it's a great question, which is talking about the WTO, what it's going to take to kind of reinvigorate it, and the panelists' take on having what will surely be the first woman running the WTO as the executive director. So I liked the question, so I won't ask it. I won't make you answer it, but I want the other panel to maybe answer it. So thank you so much, Phil. This was really great. Appreciate you coming to join us today.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Great. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Evelyn Suarez.
Hello. Hello, everybody. I'm Evelyn Suarez. I'm an international trade lawyer, and I was the past president of WIT. In fact, we had a program like this in 2016. I'm going to I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers, and we're going to jump right into the discussion because time is just flying away. But I want to make one point very clear, that both Stephen and Michael are not surrogates for the candidates, but they are certainly well positioned to give us an idea of what each candidate might focus on if elected. So I'll start with a little introductions. Michael Smart is Managing Director of Rock Creek Global Advisors, where he focuses on international trade and investment policy. Michael previously served as International Trade Counsel on the Democratic staff of the U.S. Senate Committee on Finance under Chairman Baucus. He's a member of the WIDA Board of Directors, and he received his BA from George Washington University. That's very notable. And he's also a Hoya lawyer from Georgetown, like me. Stephen Vaughn is a partner in the international trade team of King and Spalding, where he works, not surprisingly, on international trade, litigation, and policy matters. Stephen served as general counsel to USTR for more than 2 years, and he was actually acting USTR for a couple of months. So I think you will find them very, very interesting. So just to jump into our discussion, just to set a little backdrop, the Trump administration has taken a vastly different approach to US trade policy than that of others in the past 60 or so years. It is focused on America first, bringing back US manufacturing, bilateral trade agreements as opposed to multilateral trade agreements, sort of a go it alone policy that has left the WTO a little bit adrift. At the trade deficit and tariffs, lots of tariffs. It also, on the other hand, it also renegotiated the agreements that Andrea mentioned, most especially the administration renegotiated NAFTA, which is now USMCA. So let's get started. Generally, I'm going to pose a couple of questions at a time, one for Stephen and one for Michael. I'd like to start with where we stand today on trade generally. We will get to specifics like China later. We'll talk about the WTO too, so not to worry. Stephen, as the GC for USTR, you were intimately involved in the implementation of the Trump administration's trade policy. Generally, how would you describe the philosophies behind it? Are you satisfied that it is working? And for Michael, how would you see a Biden administration approach trade policy given where things stand today? And one of the things that Biden has mentioned is a Made in America program. So let's start with Stephen and then we'll go to Michael.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here, and I'm very happy to have the chance to answer these obviously important questions. I would say that the president's view was to really focus on how does trade policy affect American workers? I think in the last segment, we heard a lot of conversations about business and about what was happening to business, but I think the president really was focused on workers and focused on wages. And so I think what you saw was a situation where we wanted to do basically 2 or 3 things. One, we wanted to really review all of our current FTAs with an eye towards seeing how they were affecting workers and seeing if they could be upgraded or changed in ways that would make them more worker friendly. The second thing was to take a look at the WTO and see to what extent there needs to be reform there in order to do a better job of looking out for the interests of the whole U.S. economy, including blue collar workers and not just multinational companies. And then the third thing, I think, obviously, was a real focus on China and trying to understand how do we manage this relationship between an economy that is currently the world's second or third largest economy, depending on how you count the EU, and could soon be the world's largest economy, but is not working under market principles. So those were kind of the 3 big things. Obviously, you had a situation where from 2000 to 2016, real median income had stagnated. There was a lot of unhappiness in the country with respect to how workers were being treated. Wages just seemed to be flat and couldn't seem to grow under any circumstances. And the hope is that by making some of these changes in the trade space, you could unblock some of that. What happened, obviously, between 2016 2019 was unemployment in the U.S. went to near record lows. Workers got more bargaining power. And between 2016 and 2019, real median income went up by $6,000, which is obviously far beyond anything we've seen in the last 20 years. At the same time, all the expectations that the stock market would react badly, or trade would disappear, or you wouldn't see as much trade. Like, none of that turned out to be true. There was, stock market went way up, as most people know. Exports went up, US imports went up, trade went up. There was actually more trade than there had been before. And there was not, inflation, or, people sort of panicking and pulling out of the market, or not able to get what they wanted. So none of that happened. So I think the president really accomplished several things. First of all, he showed that you can get wages to go up in the United States. And he also showed that we actually have a lot of policy space in the trade area, that you can do a lot of things on trade. And it doesn't have the type of blowback that a lot of people thought was going to happen back in 2015 and 2016. Obviously, this year we've had the pandemic, and that's made things more difficult. But I would just note kind of two facts. One fact is that if you look at the latest reports from the OECD, they're now projecting that the U.S. economic performance in 2020 is going to be by far the strongest in the G7, and all, the decline of GDP in the Eurozone is going to be almost twice as bad on a percentage basis as what we're going to go through. And second of all, if you look at the trade numbers, our import volumes have almost gone up to where they were before the pandemic. We've almost caught up with that. The rest of the world is still, struggling with a lot of these economic issues. So the export numbers haven't bounced back as well. But I think, again, these facts show that when you look at our policy compared to other policies that they're trying in other countries, I think you see that we're doing very, very well. So I think it's been a very successful policy, and something that we can all learn from and build on going forward.
Thank you. Michael, let's hear from you.
Okay. I think Vice President Biden and his campaign have been pretty clear that there's work to do on the domestic policy front before they're going to undertake a major new comprehensive trade agreement that liberalizes trade as the way we have traditionally done. And so I think that will be very important. Those programs need to be put in place early in his administration, or I'm not sure we're going to be able to see the trade agenda take flight. And it's very important, basically saying, look, we've got to be better prepared to compete in the global economy before we kind of move ahead on a major new agreement, whether that's, job training, more investment in research and development, domestic production capacity. I think all of those things would be on the table in 2021, and things that, he would want to see kind of a commitment on those fronts before we take a major new trade liberalizing agreement. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing, and he's been pretty clear about this, is that we've got to mend fences with our allies. And there's a lot of ways to do that, and not all related to trade. But as it relates to trade, I think what that means is repealing tariffs that were imposed under the guise of national security on some of our closest allies, including allies we have mutual security arrangements with. I think that means upgrading our relations with the EU. That would involve, settlement of the longstanding, Boeing Airbus dispute, which it's not the Trump administration's fault that this is not settled, but I think now more than ever, it does need to be settled so we can both turn our sights to the more important problem of Chinese subsidies, and particularly aircraft subsidies. And then thirdly, I think is just reinforcing the importance of the multilateral trading system. Making clear that the United States is not going to withdraw from the WTO. Taking some of the good work that has been done during the Trump administration in the trilateral process between the US, EU, and Japan on subsidies, on tech transfer, on the advantages of state-owned enterprises, taking that and operationalizing it, combining it with a commitment to the multilateral system, and getting the dispute settlement mechanism going again. So, I think these three things are areas where you could see a new administration, a Biden administration, spending some political capital to get things done. You mentioned Buy American, and I tell you, it's absolutely right. You close your eyes and you listen to President Trump and Vice President Biden, and there's not a lot of difference in the way they talk about this. It makes me wonder whether the days are numbered when international trade agreements will include chapters where we provide non-discriminatory access to our procurement markets. It's interesting. I mean, because on the one hand, it makes a lot of sense, right? The United States has tremendously competitive suppliers of both goods and services that would be attractive to governments around the world. And there's the issue of getting good value for taxpayer dollars in a competitive market. So, that's why we've done it. On the other hand, there's just an unmistakable political appeal that, look, these are taxpayer dollars and they need to be spent right here at home. And so maybe that reflects the future. I guess I would hope that at a minimum, we sort of treat all of the businesses that are here operating in the United States, no matter where they might be headquartered, as creating U.S. jobs and deserving of non-discriminatory access to procurement opportunities. So that's, I guess, how I would respond to your question, Ellen. And thanks for having me. I should have said that right off the bat.
Well, I can't wait to ask this question. So I'm going to ask it of Michael. I have to ask you, what do you think that Biden's would do with the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum? President Trump discovered this tool of Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of '62, and he's used it, quite a bit. So, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, honestly, I see a lot of benefits to just rolling back those tariffs. One, it supports the objective of strengthening those alliances. Two, it helps out the many millions of workers who work in U.S. industries that use steel and aluminum. And three, it would roll back all of the retaliatory tariffs that are still in place and hurting U.S. exporters. So I'd say there's, it would be a good move. Now, I would add that there's a problem with excess capacity in steel and aluminum, and it needs to be addressed, and it needs to be done on a multilateral level. And I think we ought to get back to trying to achieve that objective. I think that's the best way to do it. And then there's, of course, there's just the politics of it, right? There's a fair amount of support behind those tariffs, whether from parts of organized labor or some members of Congress. And so, it's not an all or nothing. I mean, could a Biden administration, for example, offer to Germany, Japan, and Korea, the same deal that Canada and Mexico got, which is essentially take the burden away, adopt a generous TRQ and take it from there. I mean, so there are different ways to skin this cat.
Well, Stephen, are the tariffs, the steel and aluminum tariffs, here to stay? What do you think?
Well, full disclosure, I do represent steel producers and have done for a long time. I think I think anybody who looks at this process, there's going to be several facts that are going to come up in any interagency process. There is, Michael, as if anything understated, that there is an overwhelming volume of excess capacity around the world, especially with steel. We're talking about literally hundreds of millions of tons of excess capacity. Because there's excess capacity all over the world, it's basically impossible to get a fair price for steel outside the United States. That means that other countries, all of whom, it's including Germany and Japan and Korea, those countries are under enormous pressure to ship as much steel to the United States as they can. And that has a devastating impact on American steel producers. There was a real effort to deal with this at the multilateral level. I think a lot of people here are familiar with the works of the OECD Steel Committee. I think everybody knows that this was an issue at the G20 for a while, and they utterly failed. I mean, they literally could not even they struggled even to get China to even supply the data to look at the question. So, you know, it is not easy to sort of say we're going to lift these tariffs and suffer the inevitable harm that will result once steel starts pouring into this market. I think a lot of people remember that even Bob Zoellick and the Bush administration, who no one thinks of as protectionists, when they were faced with the steel crisis in 2001, they took measures to deal with that steel crisis. And I think some way or another, any administration is going to have to take seriously the threat to the steel industry.
I want to follow up with one question on President Trump's use of 232. There's a lot of criticism, and even on the Hill, and also litigation. Do you either of you think that there might be legislation to rein in the president's power? I mean, and would Biden support that, or would he? What do you think? What do you hear? It's been very quiet on those bills, the Portman bill and the Toomey bill, and what Grassley was willing to do or not do. So, Michael, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think if there is a second Trump administration, I think there would be a lot of interest in moving forward with legislation to reform 232. I think it would be bipartisan. I mean, there's a lot that's going to be on the agenda, so I'm not predicting that it would be passed right away. But I think all of the incentives that were there before would still exist, and I think Congress would be motivated to try to do something about that, particularly in the Senate. In the event of a Biden administration, I think, when the threat of 232 actions, I mean, what I'll call unjustified actions, I mean, used for sort of trade purposes, either to address the deficit or extract trade concessions, I think when that threat recedes and people aren't worried about, tariffs on, autos, et cetera, I just think that will lessen the incentive to prioritize 232 reform legislation, and I think it'll be crowded out, with other things. I would hope, and maybe we'll get to this later, but there, eventually there will be kind of an omnibus trade bill that looks at this, that looks at 301, that looks at trade promotion authority in a thoughtful way, as well as issues of competitiveness, which I talked about earlier. But I wouldn't predict that would be on the 2021 agenda.
Any thoughts, Stephen?
Yeah, I don't think you'll see much of a big effort to reform Section 232. I mean, I think for the most part, it's a useful tool. I think Congress obviously has a role in that process. They've had a lot of conversations between the Hill and the administration. There's been an extensive exclusion process on those 232 orders, as you know, and as Michael pointed out, there were specific negotiations with specific countries. So I think that basically ended in a landing zone where most folks on the Hill were comfortable with. And it is a very useful tool for any administration, and really not just for them, but for the whole U.S. government. So my guess is it'll stay.
Okay, let's turn to China, because everybody wants to hear about China with all those tariffs. You're obviously, Stephen, you're very familiar with the 301 investigation and all the tranches of tariffs, and then we have the phase one trade deal. Where do you think we're going to go from? Where do we go from there? From where we are at, which is phase one trade deal. I think inquiring minds, farmers, manufacturers, really want to know. So, what's your thoughts on that? What's the next move for the Trump administration if they win?
Well, I think one of the things that I think if you sort of look at what happened, and you look at the overall U.S. economy, I think it's obvious that the tariffs really, there's really no evidence that the tariffs had a significant negative effect on the economy. I mean, I'm sure you can find individual people or companies who think that had a negative effect on them. But if you look at the overall economic numbers, it just didn't really impact the economy. In fact, the economy was doing really, really well before the pandemic hit. So then you're sort of on the second question, which is, well, is this the best way to manage our relationship with China? The president thinks that the best way to manage the relationship with China is to have these intense bilateral negotiations. And I think if you look at the text of the phase one trade deal and you look at the detail and the level of commitments that China made, you see that this is far beyond any sort of commitments we've been able to get them to make before. So I think from the president's perspective, it's been a successful approach. Now we'll have to wait and see if the president gets reelected. I think at that point, China would have a very strong incentive to negotiate further with the president. And I think you could see, a phase 2 deal at some point.
President happy with this current situation because, he's got these concessions to buy a lot of agricultural products and the Chinese are a bit behind schedule. So do you think that there will be a continuation of these negotiations to move forward beyond trade, this first phase?
Everything from Ambassador Lighthizer and Secretary Mnuchin has been, they think that China is complying with the deal. They think China is going to continue to comply with the deal. And I'm actually quite confident that if the president is reelected, they will comply with the deal. I think everybody would realize that to sort of deliberately flout a deal that was approved at the very highest levels of the China government with an American president who's just been reelected, would be foolish. So I don't think that's going to be an issue. I think the question is, if you do want to have bilateral talks with China, then you need to get leverage, and things like the Section 301 tariffs played a critical role in getting leverage. And in fact, that's the whole reason why Section 301 exists. The alternative proposal, which is, well, let's see if we can get more support from other countries to go negotiate with China. That was tried in the last administration, and they really couldn't get any support from Europe. Their TTIP agreement didn't even come to the finish line. It just failed. The TPP, they did get a deal, but the concessions they had to make for the deal were so high that they couldn't get the deal to even come up for a vote in Congress. And in fact, Secretary Clinton campaigned against the deal in 2016. So I think that the idea that our allies are going to give us the type of support that we want vis-a-vis China, I don't think that's very realistic. I think it's been tried by very, very smart people who worked very hard at it, and it didn't succeed. So I would be surprised if we went down that path again. But if we do, I think we'll see the same results.
Okay, let's give Michael his shot at on Biden's trade policy. Some say it's a lot like Trump's, but I suspect it's a bit different with working with allies, et cetera. So what are we in for if Biden becomes president of China?
Yeah, I think the diagnosis of the problem is extremely similar. There's not much to disagree with, as laid out in the Section 301 report about industrial subsidies, about tech transfer, IP theft, preferential treatment of state-owned enterprises. I think part of the difference is that a Biden administration would remain focused on those structural reforms and wouldn't be waylaid and spend political capital on a shopping list for the Chinese of mandatory purchases, which kind of has the unfortunate effect of both putting the government playing a more central role in the economy, which is the opposite of what we want, and then also leading the Chinese to believe that perhaps they can get away with doing less structural reform if they just buy more soybeans. So I think that would be one difference. I think another difference would just kind of be in the consistency of the approach. I don't think it would be less tough necessarily, just more consistent, more predictable. What we've had, over the last 4 years is kind of lurching from extremes, right? Where she is my best friend, she is, responsible for unleashing the virus on the country. And so I think the result of that is that sometimes there's been a need to kind of lash out to prove a seriousness of purpose, which I think under a Biden administration would be a little clearer from day one. And then just to pick up on Stephen's last point, I think the center of political gravity and the sense on policy in Europe on China is not exactly where it is in the US, but I think it's far different than where it was 4 years ago. If you sort of look at policy, particularly in France and a few other countries, and how they're viewing the threats and risks from China's participation in the global economy, whether it comes to inbound foreign investment or export controls, or the negative effects of some of China's trade practices, it's a different picture, which is, I think, why you had, and certainly the Japanese, that would be true, and then some, which is, I think, why you had some good agreement there within the trilateral process. The question is having the determination and patience to, try to get those kind of longstanding, commitments that will support us. I have a little different view on phase one. I think, there's some interesting stuff done on trade secrets, that definitely WTO plus. Some of the ag regulatory barriers, very important. But beyond that, you compare it to the cost of what we've been through over the last few years. I'm not sure it would shake out positively if you were to weigh it up like that.
Okay, there have been a couple of questions on the WTO, and so let's turn to the WTO. And I'm going to ask Michael first, since I've been asking Steve the questions first all the time. So, what stance do you think that Biden will take on the WTO? The Trump administration has not been that friendly and has blocked the appointments to the appellate body, and so the WTO is a little bit in limbo. So, what would Biden do in regard to the WTO?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is said too often that the position taken by the Trump administration toward the WTO reflects longstanding and bipartisan positions, whether in Congress or administration. And I think there's a kernel of truth to there, but I think if you stop there, it's quite misleading because, sure, there have been a number of appellate body decisions where Congress has reacted very negatively, and they do mostly relate to trade remedies. Those are important politically and substantively, but no one would have suggested either blocking all appointments to the appellate body or potentially even withdrawing from the organization itself. And so what I think a Biden administration would want to do, and I've said this, is to pick up some of the good ideas about how we can tighten rules on industrial subsidies, identify other types of programs that are per se illegal against the rules of the WTO, because we know how hard it is to prove adverse effects cases. We take that, for example, and go after these different Chinese practices that have distorted conditions of competition, and try to figure out a reform agenda, but don't hold everything else hostage. Get the dispute settlement mechanism working again. There are a lot of ways that could be improved and reformed, but if that's not there as a backstop, we're going to have a really hard time dealing with some of the stresses in the system that relate in part to this COVID-19 economic response, which maybe we can talk about a little bit later.
Yes, Stephen, I'm sure you can tell us a little bit about what Trump's position on the WTO. Is it doomed? Does he have any use for it, or maybe I'm misreading hostility and what's been going on?
I would say it's, the question is, I think we need to be realistic about the WTO. I mean, I think no one goes to the Secretary of Defense and says, we really expect you to solve all the world's problems by working through the United Nations, right? I mean, when it comes to foreign policy, we're realistic. We understand we have a United Nations. It's good to have a multilateral framework where the Secretary of State and the President and other countries come together and talk about stuff. But there's also a recognition that we don't have the type of consensus among the world powers that you would need to give up your own independent foreign policy, right? I think the same thought applies with respect to trade, right? In other words, the WTO exists. The United States has been there. We're very active. We're happy to have conversations about how it could be made better. But at the same time, letting the WTO tell you what you can do, what you can and cannot do with trade remedies, letting them tell you what you can and cannot do with national security issues, letting them decide sort of whether or not China's a market economy and what that means. I think those are things that the Americans never agreed to in 1994. I don't think it would have made any sense to agree to them back then. I certainly don't think it would make sense to agree to them now. And I think we have to use it as a tool to the extent we can, but we have to be realistic that we and China and the EU have very, very different visions for the global economy. And as long as that's the case, any organization that runs on consensus, like the WTO, is going to be limited in terms of what you can accomplish there.
So are we going back to gentlemen agree to talk and talk?
Well, I mean, I think that there was a time in the early 90s where, obviously there was a lot of hope that we had come to the end of history and we weren't going to have trade disputes anymore. And we were all going to basically have the same type of economy. History doesn't work that way. Europe has one economic model. We have a model that is in some ways very similar to their model, but in other ways different. China has a model that really doesn't have much in common with either the EU or the US model. So I think the world trading system has to be big enough and broad enough so that we can all talk to each other. And I would point out that the period from 1946 to 1994 was one of the great periods of trade expansion in the history of the world. And the period from 1994 to 2020 has led to the rise of China, the rise of populism, a lot of unrest over trade. So I think it would be a mistake to think that it's necessarily been an improvement over what came before.
Okay, Michael, you mentioned COVID, so let me throw you a COVID question. Certainly, COVID has thrown a wrench into to the global economy and the U.S. economy. How do you think it'll affect trade policy, Biden's trade policy? And the same question for Stephen after Michael gets his shot.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's made it exponentially harder and more important because, the instinctual response to what happened this year with the scarcity of supply of certain pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, and PPE, the instinctual response to that, right, is to try to be, one's own manufacturer of all that is important to respond to a pandemic, a calamity like this. And I think that, as we're kind of adjusting to this period now, I think there is a realization that resilience of supply chain does not mean elimination of supply chains, and that there's an element of remaining diverse or being more diverse with supply chains, having greater geographic proximity, but avoiding over-reliance on one's own market in ways that don't make sense. And so that's a difficult message to carry forward, that yes, we've got to enhance our domestic manufacturing capability, but we can't resort to protectionism. And we've got to depend on the global economy in the same way that we have said to the Indians for years, for example. Don't rely on storage of food to meet your needs. There is a market that can do that far more efficiently and feed millions more people. It's really the same. It's the same here. The other, I think, real challenge is that there is going to be significantly more government spending. It's not just temporary relief to respond to the economic collapse, but I think structurally there will be more going forward toward R&D, toward manufacturing. And we have to make sure that we do that in a way that is smart. And we don't simply decide that, okay, if we can't beat the Chinese, we're going to join them, right? This can't be an arms race. That's not good for anyone. So it's another reason why we've got to get back to the table in WTO discussions. Which subsidies are in bounds and which are out of bounds. And then the last thing I would say is that I think certainly in a Biden administration, there would be a lot more emphasis on climate policy. You're already seeing that in the EU and many other places around the world. I don't think you can have an ambitious climate policy without some type of border measure. The Biden administration, the Biden campaign has said that they would go in that direction. The Europeans are saying the same thing. Getting that right is extremely hard and extremely important, so that you are in fact just addressing the problem of carbon leakage, that is production moving offshore to jurisdictions where there is no climate regime, and not allowing it to be used opportunistically for protectionism.
Hey, Stephen, your take on this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that I what I would sort of advise all of us in the trade community to do is to be somewhat humble in the face of these new economic challenges. I think one of the reasons that we ended up with some of the difficulties that we had was that there was a real consensus in town that the mid 90s was just kind of a golden age in the history of all policymaking that ever lived in the history of the world. And that any policy, whether it was a trade policy or any other kind of policy that was going to be significantly different from what we were doing in the mid 90s, was somehow out of bounds. And so we, as new challenges came along, wages are not rising. China is stealing people's intellectual property. People are finding it harder to compete in certain key industries. There's oversupplies of certain key industry. Policymakers were really hamstrung because while they had new problems, they were stuck with the same old policies from the mid 90s. So I think the pandemic is the latest example of this. This is not a question for kind of technical trade people. Policymakers are going to have to figure out how do they, restart the world economy. What do you do in a situation where the U.S. has both suffered a very significant downturn, but is still doing much, much better than, say, Western Europe? These are real big economic and policy challenges. And I don't think it's helpful for us to be running into the room telling the policymakers, hey, this policy is off the table, that policy is off the table, you can't do this, you can't do that, because we decided back in 1994 that all of that was wrong. I think we should basically let the economic experts work on that, let the political people figure out what's politically saleable, let the negotiators across the various nation states talk to each other and figure out what's feasible. And then to me, the world trade system is just going to have to adjust.
So what do you think that's what Trump is going to do in his second term? Is that the approach he will take?
I think the president is going to stay focused on what I said at the beginning, which is what is the best outcome for American workers? How do we keep that median income number going up? I mean, how do we make sure that prosperity is being shared in a way so that people don't feel like it's a rigged system, and they don't feel like it's unfair, and they feel like they have a level playing field on which to compete? That is going to be his major focus. To the extent the multilateral trading system or our trading partners or our allies, to the extent they're willing to help us with that goal, like you saw in the USMCA negotiations, the president is happy to work, make deals and have partnerships. The UK FTA is another potential example of that. But everything is going to be viewed through the transom of what is best for the American worker.
Yeah, I want to talk about, I have a question on USMCA because it's an important agreement. NAFTA was important, USMCA updates it. It doesn't make a tremendous amount of changes. It certainly makes it a 21st century agreement. It does also have some very complicated rules, especially for autos and auto parts. It also has teeth. I mean, it has labor and enforcement provisions. It was worked out in a bipartisan fashion, okay? So the question, but on the other hand, I want to ask about enforcement under a Biden administration or under the second term Trump administration. It's a bit of a fine line because you can drive industry away from, in the automotive industry, away from North America if the rules are just too complicated or enforcement is too tough. So what do you think that enforcement will look like under Biden or under Trump? So Michael, go ahead.
All right. I think a Biden administration would look to fully enforce USMCA. I mean, particularly the labor and environment chapters, which weren't there in NAFTA and were not enforceable under that agreement. So to the extent there are problems, I think the administration would look to work with the Mexican government to try to address them. And if they were unsuccessful, would use those enforcement tools. On auto rule of origin, to call them complex is an amazing understatement, really. We'll see how they work in practice. They are very costly. That's why the ITC found that on net, this will result in prices going up for consumers and exports out of the US to third countries going down. And so if the auto companies operating in the United States were to come to a Biden administration and say, look, here's what allows us to continue and even expand our investments in the United States in a way that makes sense and is less burdensome, I would hope that they would be open to that conversation. I guess the only other thing I might add is that we tend to, in the US, not have a model FTA per se, but just to go with the last agreement negotiated. And I think there are some ways in which USMCA made some significant improvements, but some ways that if it were used as the model would make it very difficult for the US going forward.
Okay, Stephen, I have one more question, really quick one after this.
Yeah, I think the USMCA will be the model going forward. I think anytime an agreement gets close to 400 votes in the House of Representatives and close to 80 votes in the Senate, I think that shows a real consensus in favor of that agreement. And I think any future USTR is going to have to take that pretty seriously. The Hill's going to want to know that your agreement is getting a lot of the same things on IP and on labor enforcement, on environmental enforcement that you got in the USMCA. I would think either administration will want to enforce that pretty strictly. The rules of origin issue is an issue that Americans are going to have to really wrestle with, which is why would anybody want to make cars in the United States? It's expensive. American workers cost a lot of money. One of the things that we saw when we started looking into it is that as of 2016, 11 of the last 12 auto plants in North America had been built in Mexico. So making the U.S. workforce competitive in the auto space is a real challenge. I think the rules of origin help a lot. And my guess is this is going to be an issue that all policymakers are going to be wrestling with, because I think the American people want to have an auto industry.
Okay, this is the last question, because we're almost out of time. TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, expires in July 2021. Do you think it'll be a tough sell, and will it look different? Michael? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, of course. It's always a tough sell. It's a battle. And I think it will likely expire and lapse for some period of time, because it's not the kind of thing that can be done easily. I wouldn't say the decks have to be cleared, but they can't be as crowded as they will be in 2021 with other issues. And it's something where the White House has to make a commitment, Congress has to make a commitment, and it's just going to take some time. But that's okay. We've had lapses in TPA before, and you could manage that. You could do other things other than comprehensive trade agreements. And so, sure, I think there will be some differences. It didn't work particularly well in several of the negotiations. I think Congress will want TPA to apply to things where it didn't under the Trump administration, so that it has a greater role. But I think that's a longer term endeavor.
Okay, Stephen, you get the last minute.
Yeah, thank you. I think, I think we saw one of the things we saw in the Obama administration is that in some ways, one way for the administration to deal with TPA issues to negotiate a deal. And then once you have a deal, then go to the Congress and start negotiating over TPA. It wouldn't surprise me to see us return to that model. In some ways, that model works really, really well for the way things are currently. The one sort of X factor in all this is if they have a UK FTA and it's ready to go, that would obviously help in terms of getting TPA renewed.
Right. Okay, well, we didn't talk about FTAs, but I think we've got a general sense. Anyhow, I have to thank both of you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody else, Bill and Andrea. I think with that, we're out of time.